Well, good evening, everybody. Last time I was back home visiting, we looked at the story of Adonijah's rebellion, and kind of just looking through the Book of Kings for some life lessons from the Book of Kings. And so I thought that we would go ahead and continue with that. And instead today, look at the reign of Jehoshaphat and kind of quickly summarize it and kind of pull out some life lessons that can still apply to us here today. The story of Jehoshaphat and his reign, it's recounted in the Book of Kings, but it's primarily recounted in 2 Chronicles chapter 17 to 20. So if you want to go ahead and turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 17, and 17, 18, 19, and 20 all deal with his reign. And so we'll kind of work through those chapters here very quickly and pull out some interesting stories and see what we see. So let's kind of orient ourselves on who was Jehoshaphat. We know that he was a king in Judah. We know that his reign was marked primarily by peace, save for a couple of battles, which we'll mention. And we're told that he didn't stray to the left or to the right, but that he followed in the footsteps of his father Asa. So he was the son of the good king Asa, which is another great king you should look at and kind of look at his story and his life for some good life lessons. So Jehoshaphat is the son of the good king Asa, and it seems that Asa, from the text, as many of the other kings did, to Asa's credit, he did not practice polygamy, as the text tells us that he only had one wife whose name was Azubah. And that, just right off the bat, kind of sets Jehoshaphat up for success. When you have a family and a home that is ordered after the order that God has set out, one father and one mother, that really sets up the family and the children for success, as it did with Jehoshaphat. So right there in the beginning of chapter 17, in the first few verses, about 1 through 5, we kind of get a good picture of a good summation of his reign and his character. We're told that God was with him because he sought God and followed his commandments and took delight in the ways of the Lord. And we're told right there immediately as well that he did not partake in the monstrous worship of Baal, but instead that he removed the high places and the unauthorized places of worship. And because of these things, in verse 5, we're told that God established the kingdom in his hand, and that Jehoshaphat had riches and honor in abundance. So it's a good start for Jehoshaphat. It seems like he has a good heart. He's following in the steps of his father Asa, who was following God's commandments. Now in about verses 10 to 13, we get a very interesting little piece here, and we learn that because of his righteousness and having the Lord on his side, that the surrounding kingdoms really were in awe of Jehoshaphat, and they really respected him, and that they did not wage war against him, and that we're told specifically that the Philistines and the Arabians, in verse 10 of 17, that the Philistines and the Arabians brought him many gifts, and that we know that King Ahab of Israel, the northern kingdom, respected him very much as well. And so that was kind of the first main point that I wanted to make, is that leaders and nations, whether they're adversarial or not, we know that many of the surrounding kingdoms were very adversarial to Judah. These leaders and these nations in the Bible and throughout history, that they respect and they acknowledge those whom God favors. And it's very evident that Jehoshaphat was favored by God. And it reminded me, there's of another leader who was greatly revered by friendly and adversarial nations alike, and that was George Washington. There's a great book called The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States. And there's about a 60-page section in there that's dedicated just to George Washington. But the author, Benjamin F. Morris, does a really good job of gathering a lot of sources and what a lot of Washington's contemporaries, whether they be American or British or French, gathering their exact words on what they thought of Washington. And when you surveyed the founders, all the founding fathers as a whole, they might say, well, so and so might have been the smartest or the most innovative, or so and so might have been the best whatever. When they asked them, but who was the greatest of all of them, they all unanimously said that it was George Washington. Even though he might not have been the smartest or quite the wisest, they all revered him as being the best among them. And upon his death in 1799, many people eulogized and wrote poems and wrote speeches about Washington when he died, and a lot of those are recorded in this book. The best American eulogy to Washington was written by Henry Lee. The one that's most probably we've all read, perhaps in history books, was written by Henry Lee, who was a contemporary of Washington in the Revolutionary War. He was a young cavalry officer in the Continental Army. And Henry Lee, in his eulogy, the beginning lines that some of you may know is that he, speaking on Washington, he was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. He was second to none in the humble and endearing scenes of private life. And an interesting note on Henry Lee, he was actually the father of Robert E. Lee. It kind of, when I read that, I thought, well, can that be right? It seems like there should be another generation there, but no, a contemporary with George Washington, Henry Lee, was Robert E. Lee's father. But that was kind of the American perspective on him. But when Washington died in 1799, the British Royal Navy, his adversary for most of his years, was ordered to lower their flags to half-mast. The London Morning Chronicle wrote that the whole range of history does not present to our view a character upon which we can dwell with such entire and unmixed admiration. The King of England said that Washington was the greatest character of the age. Napoleon Bonaparte was the new head of the French Republic, and he ordered that the people of France enter a period of mourning for 10 days upon Washington's death. And in the whole history of France, before and after that time, up until now, no period of mourning for that long has ever been ordered, even for a Frenchman. And one of Napoleon's final complaints before he died in exile, he said that the people of France wanted me to be another Washington, but I just wasn't able to do that for them. So I thought that was pretty incredible, seeing the American, the British, and the French, how they all of them were, the British and the French were all adversarial at one point or another, but they all respected him regardless. And we see that exactly with Jehoshaphat. They respect Jehoshaphat because he is a just and a pious ruler who is very evidently favored by God. So now, working down here through the rest of 17 and 18 and getting into 19, we kind of see this. Jehoshaphat's rule is very much characterized by Jeremiah 1:10, in the sense that God says, "I have placed you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up, to break down, to destroy, to overthrow, and then to build and plant." And that's exactly what we see Jehoshaphat do. The first thing that he does is he removes the high places and the unauthorized places of worship, which we kind of just mentioned in the adult Packers here. So I won't go into too much detail on what those were. We know that the high places were, generally the high places refer to idols and altars that are placed, on high places, on hilltops or on mountains, primarily to Baal or other gods. And then the unauthorized places of worship, God had placed his name at Jerusalem. This is where you are to worship. And we see all throughout the Old Testament that the Jews say, well, no, I'm going to go and I'm still going to be worshiping God, but I'm going to do it my own way in my own place. And God, explicitly says to not do that. And we see in the high places too, they were serving Baal, a very monstrous practice, and we see that in many instances the people who were kind of running the high places were sodomites, and Jehoshaphat says, out. So he removes the high places and the unauthorized places of worship, and God favors him for that. Now we have to make a note. It seems that there's somewhat of a contradiction at the beginning and at the end of Jehoshaphat's rule, because in the beginning we read that he removed the high places and the unauthorized places of worship, but then at the end it says that the unauthorized places of worship and the high places remained. So what are we to make of that? Some say, well, perhaps it is that he removed the high places, those that worship Baal, but he allowed the unauthorized places of worship to remain. I'm not really satisfied with that answer, though, and I think when you examine how it is spelled out in the text, it says that Jehoshaphat removed them, but that the people continued to do those things and to continued to practice Baal worship and worship in unauthorized places of worship. So even though Jehoshaphat removed them, the spirit of apostasy apparently was so powerful that the people continued to do it. So it's really not a contradiction at all, and that is really a point that we should look at. It's very evident, throughout Bible, throughout nations, throughout churches, that when the spirit of apostasy sets in, regardless of whether the reforms of Jehoshaphat, when the spirit of apostasy sets in people, it is very difficult for that church or for that nation to turn around. That is not to say that individuals, of course, cannot turn things around, but as a whole, as a large group, it is very difficult to once that train kind of leaves the station, the spirit of apostasy is set in, it is very difficult to turn it around. So he removes the high places and the unauthorized places of worship. So that's the tearing down. He tears down, but then how does he build up? Well, we read that he sends the Levites through the lands with the text to go, and he sends them out with the goal of kind of re-educating people. So he tears down, and then he builds up. He sends the Levites out to re-educate people. And this reminded me a lot of the story of Raccoon John Smith, who was a great kind of old-time gospel preacher, but in the church. And he would, every Sunday, he would preach for 3 hours. And the first hour and a half, he would spend kind of laying out certain denominational doctrines. So he'd do that for an hour and a half. Then they would have an intermission. And then for the next hour and a half, he would spend kind of tearing down that doctrine and pointing out the flaws in it and why it logically does not make sense. And he was very effective. He brought many people in the Reformation period, in the Restoration period. He brought many to know Christ. So his methods were very effective. But one time the story is told that his wife came up to him and said, well, the people are kind of, some people are a little bit annoyed. They think 3 hours might be a lot, and, why do we have to continually, tear down these other denominations? And Raccoon John Smith responded, and he said, if I have a glass of milk here, and I decide that instead I want a glass of water, I can't just pour my glass of water into my glass of milk. First I need to pour out the glass of milk, and then I can pour in the water. Saying, at first I needed, the denominational doctrines had been so pervasive during that time in the 19th century that Raccoon John Smith thought that, I have to spend this time, going through and kind of tearing down these denominational doctrines because it's so pervasive. And once that is gone, then I can pour in the truth. And his methods were very effective when you see the amount of people that he brought to Christ. And we still, this whole concept we still see today. Jehoshaphat thought it was necessary to send the Levites out with the scrolls to re-educate the people. And that's really, we need to continue to do this today. There's so many people who just are unwilling to read it for themselves. And that is why so many of these denominational doctrines are so pervasive. We see that, for example, with the sinner's prayer. A lot of denominations say, well, in order to be saved, you just need to say the sinner's prayer, and you're good. And that idea, the sinner's prayer is not found anywhere in the Bible. And if you say that to a lot of them, they say, well, of course it is. Well, of course it's in the Bible. And then they go and look for themselves and they can't find it. And not only is the sinner's prayer not found in the Bible, the concept is not even found in the Bible. So that is just one example that we can continue to see today. So the lessons from this instance are twofold. We see that Jehoshaphat is really following this principle of breaking down and then building up, and that's very effective. And then we also see that the spirit of apostasy is very strong. We see that with the high places and the unauthorized places of worship. So continuing on into chapter 20, we see that he is engaged in war with the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. And so those three nations who are all related to the Hebrews, they gather up their armies, they start to march against them, and the first thing that Jehoshaphat does is he prays to God, and he says, what do you want us to do? We have these three who are coming against us, and he kind of calls everyone's mind back to when they, during the period of Exodus, when they left the land of Egypt, and God tells them specifically, you're going to go through and you're going to take this land, but you're not going to enter the land of the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. God said you respect their borders. And so Jehoshaphat is saying, you told us to respect their borders. Now these people are coming against us. What are we going to do? And this is found in 20, verses 15 to 17. God, who favors Jehoshaphat, who God respects that Jehoshaphat, first his immediate response is to pray to God on what they should do. And so starting in verse 14, we read that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jehaziel, the son of Zechariah, and he said, listen, all you of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid nor dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours but God's. And God tells him, tomorrow go down against them. They will surely come up by the ascent of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the brook before the wilderness of Jeruel. You will not need to fight in this battle. Position yourselves, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord who is with you, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, for the Lord is with you. And that's exactly how it happens. They arrive to the scene of the battle, and we read in about 20 through 25. It says that the Lord kind of turned those three, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. He turned those three kingdoms against each other. They all fought each other, and by the time Jehoshaphat and his army rolls down to the scene of the battle, they're all dead. And the text tells us that it took them 3 days to gather all of the loot from these three. So, but I really like the language that God uses there. When he says, stand still, it is very reminiscent of what he tells Moses when they're crossing the Red Sea. He says, stand still and watch the salvation of the Lord. And that is really something that we ought to remember for ourselves today. I think that times of persecution are coming. They've come for many across the world already. But we see that God's army is marching forward continually. It has since the first century. The first century church has existed ever since then in the face of persecution. And so long as people have Bibles in their hands and they're reading them for themselves, the flame that is God's church will never be extinguished. All we need to do is to stand still and watch for the salvation of the Lord. Now, as we kind of wrap things up here, we cannot look at the story of Jehoshaphat without examining and recognizing some of the instances in which he compromised, on God's values. The first instance that we see of this is in 2 Chronicles 18, and that is when he makes an alliance with Ahab through marriage. Ahab, who is the king in Israel, respects Jehoshaphat and the power and the resources that they have. And so logically, Ahab, who is a very bad king, whose wife we all know perhaps better than him was Jezebel, comes to Jehoshaphat and says, well, let's make an alliance. You have a son, I have my daughter. We'll marry them, and this will be kind of the beginning of our alliance. And so, just before going any further than that, I mean, what do we think of that proposition? Knowing who Ahab's wife is. We know that she's Jezebel. We know that her daughter, whom Jehoshaphat's son would marry, Jezebel's perhaps the most wicked person in the Old Testament, and her daughter was a close second. And so God had told the people, when you go into the land, do not marry the inhabitants. And technically, Ahab's daughter doesn't fall into that category, but Jezebel did. She was a Phoenician princess, and so it was a bad setup right from the beginning. And that relationship between Jehoshaphat's son and Ahab's daughter would bring, Jehoshaphat wouldn't live to see it, but it would really bring destruction upon his whole family and ruin to a lot of the things that he had built. So that was bad from the beginning. So that was the first instance where he compromised. And then in 18 verse 3, right after this alliance is formed, Ahab comes to Jehoshaphat and he says, okay, now that we're in this alliance together, I want to go down and take Ramoth Gilead. This was taken to me a little while ago, but with our forces together, we can go down there and we're going to take it back. And Jehoshaphat says, well, okay, I guess we're related now. I guess he kind of felt like maybe he had to go down there, even though many of the prophets say that they're going to face destruction. Many of the prophets say that they're going to win. Jehoshaphat doesn't really buy that, and eventually they come across Micaiah, who says that, yeah, you guys are going to get destroyed if you go down there. They don't listen to him. They go down to Ramoth Gilead, and in this battle, they get completely decimated. Ahab loses his life in the battle, and Jehoshaphat nearly loses his. He's being chased while he's in his chariot, and he cries out to God a quick prayer, and God saves him. But after this, in chapter 19, verse 2, he is rebuked by Jehu. Now, that's kind of confusing because Jehu was a king. This Jehu is a prophet. There's two Jehus. This is Jehu the prophet. Jehu the prophet comes to him once he returns from this battle after he was told not to go. And he says, speaking to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. So it's very obvious there that God was not pleased that Jehoshaphat had compromised on God's principles, and he paid dearly for it and nearly lost his life for it. And now it seems that Jehoshaphat is a little bit of a slow learner as we go to chapter 20. Ahab is dead, but now his son Ahaziah comes to rule in Israel. And Ahaziah approaches Jehoshaphat and says, I want to make an alliance with you as well. But this time we're not going to war. Instead, I want to go and I want to create this navy because I want to continue to trade just like Solomon had in days prior. And so Jehoshaphat says, okay, we're not going to war. I guess I'll join in this alliance with you. They go down to Yon-Geber and the port city at the Gulf of Aqaba, and they create this grand navy. But before it can even leave port, a great storm comes and destroys all the ships against the rocks. And in verse 37 of chapter 20, Jehoshaphat is rebuked by Eleazar, and he prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. Then the ships were wrecked so that they were not able to go. So that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying this storm was not happenstance. God sent this storm to punish you because, again, you have compromised on God's principles. And so Ahaziah approaches him one more time. He approaches Jehoshaphat one more time, but Jehoshaphat at this point had learned his lesson. and said, no, thank you. I'm not going to compromise one more time. And so I know we're over time here. So I just wanted to conclude with a story on this topic of compromise, as a story about J.W. McGarvey. We're involved in a restoration movement here. It's a return to first century Christianity, how they worshipped, church governance. It's a return to that how they worshipped in the first century, and so the restoration movement has been going on, and it expanded rapidly in the United States from the period of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, all the way up until the Civil War. And prior to the Civil War, the Church of Christ was the fourth largest religious institution in the United States. But post-Civil War, again, we see the spirit of apostasy had really set in, and that is post-Civil War, the United States Census begins to recognize that there is two distinct groups within the Church of Christ. There's the Church of Christ, and there is the Christian Church, and they split over. The main two issues were that the Christian churches wanted musical instruments in the worship service, and they wanted missionary societies. And during this time, post-Civil War, the Christian church members outnumbered the churches of Christ 10-1. So the churches of Christ was really gutted by the Christian church. But during all of this time, there's a great Bible scholar by the name of J.W. McGarvey. He was a prominent Church of Christ Bible scholar. There was one, it was a secular newspaper on the East Coast, and writing about McGarvey, they said that, from a young age even, they said that he was the greatest Bible scholar on either side of the Atlantic at that time. And he was our brother in Christ, J.W. McGarvey, the greatest Bible scholar of the time. And one of his commentaries on Acts, is what he wrote at the age of 25, is still used in many preaching schools to this day. And he wrote it when he was 25 years old, back in the early 19th century. But during this time, J.W. McGarvey, as the Christian church is really rising up with the Church of Christ, he really fought against the introduction of musical instruments during the worship service. The first time that they introduced it at his home congregation, he got up in the pulpit, and when you read the sermon, he was just imploring them, please don't go down this road, and he very accurately laid out what was to come if they continued with this. They loved J.W. McGarvey at that congregation, but they continued to use the instrument, so he left, and this was in Lexington, Kentucky. And so he went from church to church, and his home congregation that he landed on never used musical instruments, but J.W. McGarvey felt like he needed to concede on the issue of missionary societies, and so he did. And then many years later, when J.W. McGarvey was an old man now, in the early 1900s, Jesse Sewell, who some of you might know, he was one of the early presidents of Abilene Christian University. Jesse Sewell was a young preacher in Dallas, Texas, and he heard that J.W. McGarvey was coming to town. This was about 10 years before McGarvey died. J.W. McGarvey was coming to town, and Jesse Sewell wanted to go and hear J.W. McGarvey preach. He had never heard him preach before, and he had never attended any of his classes at any of the Bible colleges. Everybody in the Brotherhood knew who J.W. McGarvey was, so he went to go listen to J.W. McGarvey one Sunday in the early 1900s in Dallas, Texas. And we don't know if it was before or after his sermon, but eventually McGarvey was sitting next to Sewell there in the front row, and he turned to Jesse Sewell and he said, most of my life here I have sought to ride two different horses riding in two different directions, and it has really spread me thin. And he was referring to, he fought vehemently against the introduction of the musical instruments, but he felt like he conceded on the introduction of missionary societies. And he told Jesse Sewell, he's like, he really kind of confessed to him. He said, I've compromised on this. I didn't think it was right at the time, but I let it go because I didn't really think anything would come of it. But Jesse Sewell remembered that. He was a young man at the time, maybe 25 years old, and he wrote it down for all of us to have. But, we see McGarvey later in life. This is just an instance where he felt like he compromised, and he really regretted it for the rest of his life. So I just wanted to conclude with that story as something that we can maybe apply to here today, something that we need to continually think of. It's written large throughout history on nations and on churches that, when you controvert God's immutable laws, bad things are going to happen. We might be on the receiving end of, the forgiveness of our sins, but the history and the Bible shows us that you're still going to pay the consequences for those sins, though, and many people have. I enjoy reading through the book of Kings, looking at the different kings. There's a lot of great life lessons that we can learn from them. Jehoshaphat is one of them. There was a lot there that we couldn't even get to, but I just wanted to go with that. If anybody has any needs of the congregation, any prayers, you can come forward now while we stand and while we sing.